ago I made a polyester, used adipic acid and amino alcohol. On a hunch I dropped in an aluminum alkyl and pushed the polymerization along with both ultraviolet and heat. Got a stiff gel out of the pot and drew it into a quarter of a pound of fibers. I only had time to determine that the fibers were amorphous, no time to draw them further to see if they would develop crystallinity. I put them in an open-mouthed jar, which I later found had been used to store mercury. One evening I took them out and found they had developed crystallinity on standing. Furthermore, the fibrous ends had split, and the split ends seemed to be tacky. Seemed unnatural to me to make a sheet of paper out of it. I nodded as I worked furiously on my notes. All of Marchare's people talked that way. They did the most fantastic things sometimes, and then talked about them as if anyone would have done the same thing. I had complained about this oddity to Mr. Spardleton when I first came to work for him. I was used to inventions that were made in understandable ways. He had smiled and asked me to quote the last sentence of 35 U.S.C. 103, the statute that set forth the conditions for patentability. It was a good thing I had memorized the statute. I recited the last sentence: patentability shall not be negatived by the manner in which the invention is made. Well, here it was again. I asked Callahan, "Did you make a sheet of paper out of it?" "Sure did. Made a hand sheet in a 12 by 12 inch mold. Pressed it out, dried it, then got busy again so I couldn't test it for a week. When I did, I started working nights to see if I could duplicate my results. Just finished this morning. Here's the hand sheet, the second one." He handed me a sheet of paper, snow white in color. I put aside my pencil and notebook to examine it. As I took it in my hand, it was obvious that it was something unusual. It was softer than a cleansing tissue and probably even more flexible. I rubbed it between my fingers and it had the most remarkable feel of any paper I had ever felt. Soft and clinging and cool and exceedingly pleasant. I knew the paper chemists call this property hand. Callahan's paper had the most remarkable hand I had ever seen. "Tear it in half," Callahan said. I took the sheet between my thumbs and forefingers and gingerly pulled, expecting the light and soft sheet to part easily. Nothing happened. I pulled harder, and still nothing. I smiled at Callahan, got a better grip, and gave it a yank. Then I twisted opposite corners around my fingers and frankly pulled at it. The absurd sheet refused to tear, and I realized how ridiculous I must look to Callahan to be unable to tear a flimsy sheet of paper. I suppose I lost my temper a little. I gathered as much of the paper as I could in each hand, bent over to put my hands on the inside of my knees, and pulled until I heard my back muscles crack. I let out my breath explosively and looked helplessly at Callahan. He said, "Don't feel bad, Carl. Nobody has been able to tear it." "You mean it?" I asked. I found myself puffing. I had not realized I was straining so hard. "Yep, that paper has a tensile of 2,800 pounds per square inch, and a tear strength equally unbelievable." I looked at the little sheet, and great possibilities began to occur to me. "Clothing," I said. "Great heavens, think what this will do for the clothing industry. No more weaving. Just run this stuff off on a paper machine at 500 feet per minute." I stopped and looked at Callahan and said, "You will be able to make it on a paper making machine, won't you?" "As far as I know." "Good," I said. "When can we try it in the pilot plant?" "Well, that's where the problem comes in, Carl. I have to leave for the West Coast tomorrow, and I'll be gone for 6 months. There's nobody else around here to take it through the pilot plant. What's worse, one of my technicians left this morning to take a job with Lafe Rude Consultants Incorporated in Boston. The technician is an ethical man and all that, but I'm afraid the word will be out on this paper now." My heart sank. Callahan said, "I've already started another of my technicians, John Bostick, on the process to make certain he can repeat my work, but that's all we can do for a few months around here. The laboratories have never been so busy. What do you think we ought to do?" The answer was obvious. "We've got to file a patent application right away. It isn't ready to file, but we've got to do it anyway." Callahan said, "Oh, we're in good shape. We know it works." I nodded and said, "What acids other than adipic will work?" "Oh, azoleic, sebacic, a few others, I suppose." "What else other than amino alcohols? What other catalysts? Do you really need mercury vapor? Will some other metallic vapor do? What about temperature variations in making the polyester? How long a cure time? How much ultraviolet? Will the fibers be better if you draw them more? Can you get those tacky fiber ends in any other way? Can you improve them? What about the sheet making conditions? Does oxygen in the air catalyze? Callahan held up his hands and said, "Okay, okay, we don't know anything about it, but we're not going to find out these things until we open a research program, and we can't open a program for at least 6 months. In the meantime, that technician may—" I held up my hands this time, and he fell quiet. We stood silently until I asked, "All the information in your notebooks, Henry?" He nodded, and I continued, "Well, I'll be back tomorrow to talk to you and Bostick. We'll just have to file a patent application on what we have." We chatted a while about his work on the West Coast, and then we shook hands and I left. I had a few moments to think in the cab before I talked with Mr. Spardleton. Here I was in that situation that a patent attorney dreads. I had an incomplete invention, one that required a great deal of work before it could be filed, yet I had to file it now, in the incomplete condition. With it all, here was a most significant invention, one that would make the world take notice. This was one of the rare ones. I could feel it in my bones. It was obviously an industry founder, a landmark invention on a par with the greatest, even in its incomplete condition. By golly, I was going to do a job on this one. Mr. Spardleton was in a bad mood when I entered his office. I didn't have a chance to say a thing before he bellowed at me. "Mr. Saddle, do you know what a plasticizer is?" "Why, yes. It is a material, generally a solvent, that softens and renders another material more flexible." "That's right." His fist banged on the desk. "Yet here," he waved an office action at me, "is an examiner who says that the term plasticizer is indefinite, and I must give a list of suitable plasticizers when he knows that Rule 118 forbids me to put in such a list. Can you imagine? He is saying in effect that a chemist who works with synthetic resins does not know what a plasticizer is, and I must take him by the hand and teach him something he learned in freshman chemistry. It has nothing to do with the invention either. I am claiming a new kind of lens holder, and I point out that the interior of the holder may be coated, if desired, with a plasticized synthetic resin coating. My, I don't know what the office is coming to. The patent office is the only institution in the world that does not know the meaning of the phrase room temperature. Some day— What's the matter, Mr. Saddle?" I had pulled up a chair and hunched down in it. Mr. Spardleton recognized the symptoms. He put down the offending office action and settled back and waited for me to tell him my troubles. I said, "I've got a hot invention. It is a paper that will replace cloth, strong, flexible, cheap too. We've only made one version of it though, and I have to file an application right away because one of Callahan's technicians left and we can't risk waiting." He nodded and I went on, describing to him all the details of the invention and the situation. When I finished, I stared morosely at the floor. Mr. Spardleton said, "What's the problem? File a quick application now, and later on, when you have more information, abandon it and file a good full-scale application." I looked at him in surprise and said, "But somebody else has just as much information as we have, and he may start to experiment right away. That technician knows as much as we do. In another 6 months, they could file a complete application and beat us out on dates. They'd be the first with the complete application." "Well, what do you propose to do about it?" I shrugged. "I'll have to make up as good an application as I can right now. We'll make some guesses at how the research would go, and put it in." "Oh, now look, you don't know—" He began ticking off the points on his fingers. "If you really need the trialkyl aluminum, or the mercury-treated glass surface, or the heat, or the radiation, or any combination of them. You don't have any idea of the conditions that are necessary to produce this paper." "I know." "All you've got is a single example that works. If you make your claims broader than that one example, the examiner will reject you for lack of disclosure. This is basic in patent law. Ex parte Cameron, Rule 71 and 35 U.S.C. 112 will do for a starter." But I hadn't worked with Mr. Spardleton for 9 years for nothing, and he had taught me how to play this game pretty well. I sat up straighter in my chair and said, "Yes, but in Ex parte Dick and Moncrieff, the disclosure of nitric acid as a shrinking agent for yarns was enough to support a claim for shrinking agents broadly. The claim did not have to be limited.